Hello, everyone. Welcome to this talk on the archaeology of ancient Egypt, and more particularly, what I'm calling everyday Egypt. The ancient Egyptian civilization is iconic. Many people who don't know much about archaeology per se are familiar with objects and sites from ancient Egypt: the pyramids, Tutankhamun's gold mask, the mask of the pharaoh, and ideas of Egypt as a sort of a strange, exotic, mysterious place, magical perhaps. One of those iconic objects, and it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. One of my favourite archaeological artifacts that I've never actually seen in real life is this, the first picture that we're looking at. It's a bust, the iconic bust of Neferen Feruaten Nefertiti, Queen of Egypt, who lived 1370 to 1330 BC. Strictly speaking, not Queen of Egypt. She was the wife of the pharaoh, wife of the king. Didn't actually make a queen. Principal wife of Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, who we will meet again later in this talk. He changed his name to Akhenaten and is known as the heretic king, as we will see a little bit later. No other queen has ever been shown so frequently on monuments. She was worshipped and prayed to as a goddess. The tall blue crown is unique to Nefertiti. There's no other example has been seen of this type of crown. She's a iconic representative of what we might think of as ancient Egypt, the royal family, their tombs, their lives. But this bust also represents one of the first times we have a name of a commoner, a name of someone who wasn't an actual member of the royal family or the social elite. The name of the sculptor who made this bust, and he was called Thutmose, and this bust was found in a workshop, a place where Thutmose himself would have employed, for want of a better word, workers, painters, sculptors, moulders, because thousands of copies of this bust would have been made and to be distributed throughout the kingdom. So, moving on from that, as I said, I want to look at everyday Egypt, not the lives of the kings and queens, but the lives of the people who actually built the pyramids, actually built the tombs. As the first example of that, we have this artifact, this piece, this sculpture, also considered unique because it's not an image of a member of the royal family. This about 150 millimeters tall. It's a boxwood statuette of a serving girl, and is in the Museum of Durham University. One of their most famous artifacts, not as famous outside the world of archaeology as Nefertiti and Tutankhamun, but certainly famous within it. Famous for its quality of its craftsmanship, for its natural pose, which is very unusual in Egyptian art. Egyptian art is very stylistic. The girl carries a jar. You can see her hip is thrust out. She's taking the weight. It's an observational piece of someone doing their job. It's also a functional piece. The lid of the little jar comes off, and it was used as a cosmetics holder. And that doesn't necessarily mean it was used by female, both men and women in ancient Egypt, or in the ancient Egyptian upper classes certainly, used cosmetics. So where are we talking about? Egypt. This is Egypt. Quickly, the gift of the Nile. The River Nile, basically, with desert on either side. The Nile, the foundation of everything, the whole civilization. The flooding of the Nile, with incredibly fertile soil on an annual basis, allowing for the rise, for a food surplus and the rise of the civilization that we know. The Egyptians, of course, the ancient Egyptians, didn't call the country Egypt, which is an Arabic-based word. For the ancient Egyptians, the land was known as Kemet, which translates to black land, a description of that fertile soil that spills from the Nile. There were Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, north and south, were two kingdoms originally, and around about 3000 BC were unified under a single king into one single kingdom, the Kingdom of Kemet. Europeans and European empires, I suppose, have been fascinated with Egypt, at least since the time of the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks colonized and conquered Egypt, the Romans after them. Moving forward in time, the post-French Revolution, the empires that emerged in the war between France and Britain, fought over Egypt. 18th and 19th and into the 20th centuries, Egyptian style, Egyptian look, Egyptian stories were fashionable. The object on the left of the slide is the Denon chair, made in mahogany with gilt and bronze. It's found in the Victorian Albert Museum in London, made around about 1813. And it's a copy that could be found in this type of object could be found in big houses throughout Europe in the 18th and 19th century, but it's a very detailed and very precise copy of actual ancient Egyptian objects. We will see in a later slide a tomb painting that shows something very similar to this in an ancient Egyptian context. The picture on the right, Boris Karloff in The Mummy. It's the poster for the film, the advertising poster for the film, made in 1932, in which Boris Karloff plays Imhotep. Imhotep, like Thutmose, who made the Nefertiti bust, Imhotep himself, not as portrayed in this film, but Imhotep is a name that was famous in ancient Egypt itself and remains famous to this day. Imhotep was a real person, again, not as portrayed in the film, and again is one of the few commoners for whom we have an actual name. The real Imhotep was a counselor to Djoser, a very early pharaoh, and is believed to have been the architect, the designer, the engineer of the very earliest pyramid, which was a step pyramid. Because the portrayal in the film is not based on actual ancient Egyptian ideas. It emerges from the 19th century Gothic tradition. The first story in which a mummy returns from the dead to threaten the living was actually written by a son of Edinburgh. It was written by Arthur Conan Doyle. The story is called Lot Number 249 and was written in 1892. And as I said, that's the first time in European literature and English literature we get this idea of a mummy returning from the dead to threaten the living. This was not an Egyptian concept. And prior to that, European mummy stories were actually romances and even erotic fantasies. Another way in which Egypt has been brought home, if you like, and was popular in 19th century fashion was, in true Egyptian style, if you like, an obsession with burial and the remains of the dead. The pyramid on the left is not in Egypt. It's in Edinburgh. It's in the Dean Cemetery, and it was built by an Andrew Rutherford, who had engraved in Latin on the bronze plaque that you see on the door, Andrew Rutherford, surviving against his will, placed this tomb in mourning to his most beloved wife and to himself, 1852. I mean, that feels sort of almost like what an ancient Egyptian nobility might have done as well, the sort of type of inscription they would have said. The tomb on the right, carved to look like an Egyptian rock-cut tomb, with a carved stone palm tree standing in front of it, is in the Grange Cemetery, and was also built by a wealthy Edinburgh, William Stewart, for also his dead wife, Susan Ann Bridges. And when she died, William commissioned sculptor Robert Thompson to design a, quote, Egyptian portal to the land of the dead, which then became the family tomb. If you look just behind the palm tree, there's what would have been the door in the real tomb, and it's carved to look like a door, and it's also carved slightly ajar. This may reflect William Stewart's interpretation of ancient Egyptian belief, in which the soul of the deceased could come and go from the tomb as long as there was a body preserved in the tomb for the soul to come back to. This is why the Egyptians mummified the dead when they could. A view of Princess Street, believe it or not, where an ancient Egyptian obelisk might have stood, if and perhaps in a parallel universe it does. That's a view from the West End, from sort of Shandwick Places. You can see St John's Cathedral behind a very Egyptian style obelisk. Placing Egyptian obelisks was in your city was a fashionable thing to do. Cleopatra's Needle in London. There's a its pair, its sister, if you like, is in Paris. This isn't an ancient Egyptian, or wouldn't have been an ancient Egyptian obelisk. This would have been built to be like an ancient Egyptian obelisk. And this is William Henry Playfair, the architect's entry for a competition to design the Scot Monument. As we know, it didn't win. We don't have an Egyptian style Scot Monument at the West End. We have further down Princess Street the Scot Monument we all know and perhaps love. But I sort of wish this one had been built, but it wasn't to be. But it reflects the near obsession with ancient Egypt among architects, designers, furniture makers. Playfair himself mostly built in ancient Greek style, but he was clearly interested in ancient Egyptian style as well. Another thing to note about the Egyptian civilization is its long time scale. Ancient Egypt lasted for a long time. For example, when Tutankhamun was buried in the Valley of the Kings, the Great Pyramid was already 1,235 years old. It was already an ancient monument and recognized as such by the Egyptians themselves. The coin on the left is one of the very few portrait images we have of Cleopatra. Cleopatra VII, probably one of the most famous Egyptian pharaohs, because she was by this time she was pharaoh in her own right, and she was Queen of Egypt and pharaoh in her own right. She was also Greek by descent, certainly the last of the Ptolemies. The Greeks conquered Egypt under Alexander the Great. The building on the right is not ancient Egyptian or modern Egyptian, for that matter. It's in the United States of America, and it's the first Pizza Hut ever to be built in 1958. why am I showing a picture of a Pizza Hut? I'll tell you why. Cleopatra died in 30 BC. What that means is she lived closer to the building of the first Pizza Hut closer in time to the building of the first Pizza Hut than she did to the building of the Great Pyramid. Egypt lasted as a civilization for thousands of years. Egypt is also famous for its writing, the hieroglyphs. It's difficult to tease apart exactly which is the oldest writing in the world, but it's either Egypt or Mesopotamian, where cuneiform, a very different type of writing, was invented. And cuneiform, the Mesopotamian writing, is the ancestor of European scripts today, or of Greek and Latin and the following European scripts. Ancient Egyptian isn't. But ancient Egyptian writing wasn't just hieroglyphic. They also had a cursive writing. The hieroglyphic is common in ritual and royal contexts, but for, it's hard to say everyday purposes, because most people couldn't read and write, but for middle management, if you like, everyday purposes, writing is certainly in later years of the civilization is written in ink on paper made from papyrus, and it's the same language but with a cursive script that you can write with a pen, and that's much less known about, I think. Another thing to point out is we've already said and looked at the length of Egyptian civilization, by which I mean the length of Egyptian history, which has writing and kings and pilgrims. But Egypt also the ancient Egyptian civilization didn't emerge fully formed from nowhere. It evolves like any other society, and this means Egypt also has a long prehistory. It has, like the rest of Africa, like the rest of Asia, like Europe. It has Paleolithic, an Epipaleolithic, which is their equivalent of what in Europe would be Mesolithic. It has a Neolithic, the first farmers, a Stone Age, basically, and really realistically, the pyramids emerge from a Stone Age society. The pyramids are built by what is very little metal using society, copper, but pre-Bronze Age. My example, it's hard to cover millions of years with one object, but my example here is one of my favorite things. This is a ceremonial flint knife. It is a giant ceremonial flint knife. There's no scale on this, unfortunately, but this is about 1 meter long. It's built for ceremonial purposes. It was founded Hierakonpolis, a pre-dynastic period, right on around about 3500 BC. It's right on the cusp of Egyptian prehistory becoming Egyptian history. It was found in the same context as another giant object, the Nama palette, which is associated with the first king of a unified Egypt. So this represents the period when Egypt is passing from prehistory and into history. It also represents another theme, if you like, that will come up in this talk: the giantism. Kings like to be seen as physically bigger than the rest of their population, and the aristocracy similarly, as we will see. And it's as if they could have a giant knife. This is on display in the Museum of Scotland on Timber Street, and alongside it is a flint knife, identical, but 10 centimeters long, which would be a working knife, whereas this is made for depositing in a temple in a ritual manner. As I said, that the Egyptian nobility, aristocracy, the top of the pyramid, the social pyramid, presented themselves as lording over their subjects, as giants, if you like. This is a tomb relief, portion of a mastaba wall. A mastaba was a type of tomb that was used before the pyramids and continued to be used after pyramids as well, but it was generally used by the aristocracy below the rank of pharaoh and the pharaoh's family. But you can see this is showing the funeral procession of the owner in the tomb, and the giant legs actually represent the statue, but this is which would be placed in the tomb, an oversized giant statue, and you can see that the supervisor of the workers is slightly bigger than the workers, and then as they go descend in rank, like, the people are portrayed as smaller and smaller. And at the bottom of the picture, if you can see my cursor moving, there's different workers preparing different things to be placed, mostly foodstuffs, bread, birds. These look like pots, probably containing things like cheese, animals, to be placed in the tomb. And these workers, you see, they've got a rope where they're pulling the statue, and they're supervised by a man with a staff and a bit of a fancy hat. So this is probably a good representation of Egyptian social structure, and I want to talk about these people down here more than this person here. Archaeology has obviously concentrated a lot on pharaohs, on the tombs, on the shiny things, on the gold. It's only more recently that greater emphasis has been placed upon excavating the tombs of the everyday folk, of workers, of artisans, of farmers, etc. That's not to say that kind of excavation has never been done. Since the early days of archaeology, it has. It just wasn't dominant. This is, as the slide says, the photograph here is of Flinders Petrie. Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie, Fellow of the Royal Society, Fellow of the British Academy, born 3rd of June 1853, died 28th of July 1942. Petrie's widely and rightly regarded as one of the founders of modern archaeology, scientific, methodical archaeology as a scientific process, rather than tomb robbing, rather than looting interesting things and bringing them home to put in your garden, which did happen. And he, in fact, published in 1904, Petrie published a book called Methods and Aims in Archaeology, which is the first textbook, if you like. It's the first book that details how to excavate, the correct manner, the technicalities of methodically excavating, including a relatively new addition to the archaeologist's toolbox: photography. Flinders Petrie photographed much like we would now, things as they emerged out of the ground and as they were excavated. For example, the picture on the right. This was one of Flinders Petrie's own photographs of one of Flinders Petrie's own excavations in 1908. Petrie discovered an undisturbed burial in Thebes, which he excavated and recovered on behalf of what is now the National Museum of Scotland. I think it was called the Museum of Antiquaries then, but it's now the NMS. And the results of this excavation are on display in the Ancient Egypt Gallery in Scotland. The identity of two people, because there were two graves, two people buried in this one grave. You can see a quite elaborate sarcophagus type coffin there, where my cursor is circling, and you can see quite a small, plain, much more simple coffin where I'm indicating now. Believed to be from the 17th or early 18th dynasty, about 250 years before Tutankhamun was buried. The coffin contained the body of a slender woman around 5 foot tall, aged about 18 to 25. She wore a magnificent collar of gold rings, a pair of gold earrings, 2 pairs of gold bracelets, and a girdle of electrum rings. Electrum is an alloy of gold and silver. Basically, aristocratic, rich, wealthy burial. The smaller plain coffin contains a mummified body of a 2 to 3 year old child, which was also wore a necklace of gold rings, a pair of gold earrings, a girdle and anklets from precious metals and ivory bangles. A wealthy burial of, presumably, we don't actually know, but presumably mother and daughter. So far, so classic Egyptology, if you like, the archaeology of the upper classes, if for the first time properly and methodically recorded. And if that's all Flinders Petrie had done, he would be, well recognised for doing so. But Flinders, he did so much more. He was one of the first archaeologists to make a point of going looking for the archaeology of everyday life. His key excavation is at Kahun, which was a town specifically built for one purpose and one purpose only, a town built to house the workers of who were building Pharaoh's tomb. The town was about 800 meters from the pyramid, out in the desert, away from cultivated land. The pyramid is on the left, is not what you might think of as a pyramid, and it's not made out of carved stone blocks like the famous ones. It's made out of mud brick, so it's in not such great conditions, not such great preservation, but you can see you can imagine how it may have looked, how it would have looked as a proper pyramid that hasn't before it collapsed. But the key thing was Petrie didn't excavate the pyramid; he excavated the town, which you can see as my cursor moves over it. The little squares are individual houses laid out in terraced streets, laid out in a proper grid pattern. Larger buildings, probably for workshops, storage, tools, food, etc. And then rows and rows and rows of houses. This is a planned town, a purpose-built town, complex, sophisticated living space for workers, and that's going to be key to this whole idea that Egyptian society is strongly hierarchical, and most people were not members of the elite. But at the same time, there's still, thanks to the Bible and films and stories, this idea that the pyramids were built by slaves, and this is not true. Egyptian society did include slavery at different times and for different reasons, but slavery wasn't foundational to the economy at all. The great monuments that we see were built by labour that was paid in. It's not a money economy, but they were paid in food and resources, and were a mixture of labourers doing the heavy lifting and more to the point relevant to this town, skilled craftspeople, skilled artisans, carpenters, sculptors, painters, all the skills required to build, as you might imagine, to build the magnificent things that survive. As I think I mentioned earlier, the fundamental basis of the Egyptian economy, the fundamental basis of all societies now, even now, is agriculture. There's no, our 21st century high-tech society is based upon, first and foremost, people have to be fed. But agriculture for the Egyptians was the basis of their economy and their wealth, but it was the basis of the wealth of the people who had wealth, and they weren't the people who necessarily did the work. This another wall painting here shows a full range of farming, of agricultural practices and food processing. Again, this comes from the tomb of the people indicated here, who will be the wealthy landowner and his wife, who will receive all the produce, and not all the produce, will receive the bulk of the produce, the surplus, from quote unquote their land. But the nice thing about this painting is it actually shows all of those that in action. Lots of people doing lots of different things, from digging and turning over the soil here and here, to spades and shoveling here, to ploughing with cattle. I say ploughing with cattle, strictly speaking, the Egyptians didn't have a plough. They had what is called an ard, A-R-D, which functions as a plough, but a true plough has sideboards at the bottom which turn the soil over, whereas this just has a straight stick at the bottom which pulls a furrow through the soil without turning the soil. You've got large baskets and containers here. You've got women working here, much less represented in Egyptian art than the men, but we do have some women working here. They almost certainly worked in the fields alongside the men, or strictly speaking, possibly behind them when they're ploughing, sowing the seed, or when harvesting, picking up the grain. And children were also employed in the fields, chasing away birds. We have pictures here of threshing and winnowing. Nice, interesting use of perspective, which you don't often see in ancient art. All sorts of different foodstuffs here gathered together, including a little fish farm here, a pond in which fish are kept till they reach the right size. And you see a big one being lifted out there. The majority of the population of ancient Egypt were farmers, the vast majority of the population of ancient Egypt. And they also provided the labour that helped the skilled workers in the building of cities and monuments and tombs. When the Nile was flooded, although that was essential for the agriculture because it deposited the fertile soil, you couldn't actually do anything during the flooding time. So a lot of the farmers would be employed as labourers on the big projects that the skilled craftspeople were managing and running and doing the skilled jobs in. Another quick picture showing also, this is probably actually the wealthy tomb owner pretending to be a farmer, probably already actually did this himself. There's a nice picture of an Egyptian art, and that's good enough to be able to reconstruct how it worked from. Note also here at the bottom another key aspect. Two key aspects of the ancient Egyptian diet: date palms and olive trees. This is a sickle. This is a working tool. This is what the actual farmers would be working with. It's carved out of wood. It dates to around about 1300 BC. Some of them are missing, but you can see the blade here and here is made out of chipped stone. It's a flint, presumably. There's no metal in this. It is effectively a Stone Age object. Same is true in the European Bronze Age. Working tools are not made out of bronze. They're generally speaking still made out of stone. Bronze is reserved for the elite. The other, if you like, is interesting. There appears to be some hieroglyphs here. The other interesting thing about this, as I say, it's carved out of wood. Beautiful work, craftsmanship here. But it's carved to look like a cattle jawbone. Occasionally I found sickles actually made from cattle jawbones, but cattle were very important in ancient Egyptian society. In many ways, they're important economically. You saw them pulling the ards to plough the field, sources of milk, cheese. They're also very symbolically important symbols of kingship, and also symbols, religious symbols. Some of the gods are often represented as cattle or with cattle horns. What is the produce from this farming, and from what is the gift of the Nile? Ancient Egypt, by the time Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire, it was known as the breadbasket of the empire. It was an incredibly productive, agriculturally productive land, huge surplus, which the Romans proceeded to loot, as they did everywhere. And of course the primary product and the staple of everyone's diet, certainly the majority population diet, bread. This is a loaf of bread. It's not white sliced. It's this interesting shape, and the in tombs, they're often found in tombs. Loaves of bread, well preserved in the hot, dry atmosphere of Egypt. And yes, often found in what to our eyes are interesting, odd shapes, including this shape and lots of others. It may have been the staple, but it was, you can be creative even when making a loaf of bread. These are often found in tombs because they would have been placed there to feed the tomb occupant in his or her afterlife. In addition to bread, and possibly not just in addition to bread, archaeologists are still debating which came first. They're made from the same ingredients, yeast, natural yeast in the case of in ancient Egypt, and grains. The other staple of the Egyptian diet, certainly of the non-elite, was beer. Egypt is probably the first place beer was ever made. This is a brewery, basically. We're back at the place I struggled to pronounce earlier. We're back at Hieratic, which is there on the map. This is a plan of an archaeological excavation showing multiple vats of beer. This is a photograph. These are the vats. You put fire under here to warm things up. This is currently, and that may have actually changed because just in the last few weeks, the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities have announced the discovery of another brewery, which might actually be older than this one. This one's dated to around about 3600 BC, and when it was excavated, was the world's oldest installation for large-scale beer production. Analysis of residues in the vats have confirmed that it was beer. It was what the world would recognise as beer was made here, and it recommended these vats alone, when operating at full capacity, could make 325 litres of beer per round of manufacturing. Ancient Egyptian beer, as ancient beer generally, would have tasted quite different to beer today. Probably not very pleasant to our palates. It wouldn't be fizzy for a start, no carbonation. Flat, unfiltered malt beverage with a low alcohol content. Much like what was the norm throughout Europe in, say, the Middle Ages. Small beer. Beer was a staple part of the diet, and a way of getting liquid that wouldn't poison you as well. Our information on the bakeries and breweries, or other than from excavations, the other thing that provides us our with understanding of how these processes worked, how these industries worked, is provided by tomb models that were placed in the tombs of the sort of middle-ranking people, mostly. The elite could afford to have cattle actually slaughtered and placed in their tomb, actual loaves of bread in their tomb. The Egyptians believed in an afterlife. They believed that you required all of the things you required in this life in your afterlife. So you required food and water and servants, if you were the sort of person who had servants. If you couldn't quite afford to have a huge tomb with all of the real things placed in it for you, what you could do, Egyptians were quite pragmatic about their religion, and they were very religious, but they were quite pragmatic about it. Someone came up with this notion: well, if you made a model of those things and placed that in the tomb, that would come to life. So we find models. This is a combined, probably bakery, brewery, and butcher. We have a dead cattle here. There's a person carrying a classic dairy type double shoulder bucket pail thing there, and that looks like a oven. There's the eternal woman in the ancient world grinding corn. Storage jars here. So this is a model of people making your bread, your beer, and your meat, which would magically come to life to provide your bread, your beer, and your meat in the afterlife. We also have two models that show us how the houses of the non-elite also live, because you would, if you were an elite person, you would need to have your workers, your farmers, your labourers with you. So you would place models of their houses. So this gives us, we saw earlier Flinders Petrie's excavation, but of course that was an excavation of quite high standing walls, but the roofs had collapsed, etc., etc. So if we combine the information we get from excavation with the information we get from models like this, we have quite a good idea of the houses, or quote unquote ordinary Egyptians lived in: mud brick, flat roofed houses, similar to the way people live. Some houses in North Africa and the Middle East until this day. You can also see here in the courtyard of the house a lot of the produce laid out. Jars and containers and things that look like cuts of meat, loaves of bread. And again, remember, all this would magically come to life to feed and provide for the owner in the afterlife. As I said, the farmers that constitute the majority of the population, and the basis of everything. The other layer in this hierarchical society, like as I've mentioned, are skilled craftspeople, skilled workers. The people who are housed in the Flinders Petrie excavated town, the people who built cities, built monuments. These objects are both on display in the Ancient Egypt Gallery of the Museum of Scotland, and they would both be recognisable to a stonemason. These are stonemason's tools, and or a carpenter. Today, they would be recognisable in the 21st century. On the left, here we have a double-coned calcite alabaster plumb bob, which would be hung by a string here. It gives you a vertical line. You'll see brickies using these today, not made out of alabaster. You will see archaeologists using today. I've got one in my tool bag, made out of steel rather than alabaster. But archaeologists use plumb bobs today to get a true vertical line when we're drawing sections, drawing soil profiles. The object on the right is a mason's square, except it's not. These two pictures are not to the same scale. This is teeny tiny. A model of a real square, which would be possibly carried or possibly worn as an amulet, as a badge, possibly as a badge of identity by a stonemason. But again, you can see objects like this, full size in the 21st century and small size in the 21st century, as badges of identity. If you, for example, go to the Masonic Hall on George Street. On the right, a mason's mallet, made of wood, found in Upper Egypt, Deir el Bahari, and this is 18th dynasty, so that's 1550 to 1292 BC. Identical to what a stonemason would be using in the 21st century. Stonemason is a less commonly seen trade these days, perhaps, than in ancient Egypt, but Historic Indictment of Scotland, for example, still runs stonemasonry apprenticeships to restore the buildings in their care. And if you ever see them at work, they'll have mallets that you could swap for this, and you wouldn't notice. The toolkit here on the left is a carpenter's toolkit, full set, like an axe, a saw, various adzes, various chisels and awls. Again, all of this, it would be made slightly differently, but all of this would be recognizable to a carpenter today. And this was actually found in a bag. It was basically found in a carpenter's toolbox. And clearly represents a set used by a skilled worker. And the workforce, as I say, the modern workers would recognise the tools and what ancient Egyptian workers did with them. The other thing that we have the ancient Egyptians to thank for, if you like, well, depending on your perspective, I suppose, the very notion of downing tools, of going on strike. The little badge I've just sneaked in here, in a sense. I've noticed this, the square and the plumb bob hanging from it. This is from the 19th century, and is a the badge of the Spanish section of the First International, one of the first times where workers in modern times were organised for their benefit. On the left is this is the Turin strike papyrus, so called because it's held in the Egyptian Museum in Turin in Italy. Google this, look it up. It's a fascinating document. If you do so, please try not to confuse it with the Turin erotic papyrus, which is a real thing and also held in the Turin Egyptian Museum. Is a fascinating document, but it's basically Egyptian pornography. The strike papyrus, on the other hand, is a contemporary account, an ancient Egyptian account. Say the cursive writing that we mentioned near the start of the talk. It's not hieroglyphs. It's a contemporary account of the first labour strike in recorded history. This occurred on the West Bank at Thebes during the reign of Ramesses III, when the tomb workers of Deir el-Medina did not receive their rations, their wage, which would mostly be beer. Which remember is a foodstuff. Beer is consumed for its calorific value. It's consumed as food. And the tomb workers, the builders, the skilled craftspeople building tomb hadn't received their wage. In the 29th year of Ramesses III's reign, the scribe Amenachte records at the village of Deir el-Medina a series of strikes and sit-ins, all the things we might associate with industrial dispute today, undertaken by the artisans who lived there. These were highly specialised workers brought into the village in order to work in secret on the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Issues seem to have been bubbling under for several years, according to the scribe's records. But then the actual strike, the first strike ever recorded, is dated to the year 29, second month of Peret, which is the Egyptian name for the growing season, day 10, with the workers passing the walls, i.e. they walked out, to complain, "We are hungry," after having not been paid their wage rations. And then they staged a sit-in. It's recorded they staged a sit-in behind the mortuary temple of Thutmose III, an old mortuary temple. The records go on to say that the strike won, and the workers were paid their rations. The rations were resumed, and they went back to work. This is not unique. Other similar disputes and similar management problems and strikes are recorded in other papyri as well. But this is the oldest. Women in ancient Egypt, are poorly represented in the archaeological record, like they are in many places. That's partly the nature of Egyptian society, and it has to be admitted partly result of, until recently, most archaeology being conducted by men. This is all changing for the better. Here are two examples of representations of women we do have. On the left, from a wealthy tomb, we have two roles that were available, if you like, for women within the context of royal palaces, etc., as servants, but trained and skilled servants, and presumably in the case of the two women on the left, who are musicians. You can see a double-barreled flute coming out there. They're quite elaborately dressed. And they've got these cones on the top of their heads, which were probably a soft perfumed wax that melted and gave. Oops, hang on. The other role is can only really be described as dancing girls. That's they are for the entertainment of the householder. near naked, and dancing. We're back on the right here to a tomb model of a granary stroke bakery. You can see a male figure sitting on the roof, sunning himself and supervising. And here is probably, we saw it earlier, the most common image of a woman in ancient Egypt bent over a quern, a large stone, a large flat, slightly bald stone, across which you would rub another stone, grinding grinding corn, wheat, barley, to make flour, probably all day, every day. And that captures probably quite nicely a certain aspect of social relations in Egypt. Children are even more poorly represented in the archaeological record for various reasons to do with both Egypt itself and with the archaeology of Egypt. When we do see them, again, they tend to be the families of the wealthy, they tend to be the children of the wealthy. I said when we saw the 19th century copy of an ancient Egyptian chair, remember it had lion's feet, and I said we would see a wall painting of the real thing. There's an ancient Egyptian chair in a wall painting of a very similar style, and with lion's legs and lion's feet. I'm showing this picture because it's a rare picture of a child, obviously male child. This is probably a picture of mother and daughter with grandson. Children, when they are portrayed, almost always portrayed naked. It doesn't necessarily mean that children in Egypt went around naked all the time. There are symbolic conventions in ancient Egyptian art, and one of those was that children are portrayed naked. It's probably just a signal that they are children. I mean, it's possible that they did run around naked, but it's certainly an artistic convention. Interestingly, one that isn't shown here, it's normal also, particularly with male children, that the child would have the so-called side lock of youth. So their head would be shaved, apart from a little pigtail which would come out the side of the head. And that child, certainly it's not portrayed on that picture, so that's also unusual. I don't have an explanation for that. Other evidence we do have of childhood are toys. On the left, a wooden toy cat, dated to 1550 to 1070 BC, Egyptian New Kingdom. Its cats were domesticated in Egypt. Cats were worshipped as gods and goddesses in Egypt. That it's not as good for the cat as you might think, because by the late first millennium BC, cats were bred on an industrial scale for the cult of the cat goddess Bastet. Basically, you go to a temple, buy a cat, sacrifice the cat to the cat goddess. It's a strange notion to our eyes, but that's how it was. But these are toys. So you've got a toy cat and a toy mouse. These are not thought to be tomb models, so that the mice would come to life in the tomb, because I mean, who would want that to happen? These are genuinely believed to be children's toys. As is this, a spinning top, which would be recognizable to children, certainly in Britain, immediately post World War II, and pre-electronic toys, spinning tops, and have been spinning tops since ancient Egypt. I right at the start with the bust of Nefertiti. I mentioned that she was the wife of Amenhotep IV. This is Amenhotep, a sculpture, a bust of Amenhotep, her husband. He's the hieratic king. Changed his name to Akhenaten. He completely reorganized Egyptian religion and Egyptian society. He's often attributed to founding the first ever monotheistic religion. He abolished the whole pantheon of Egyptian gods and said there was only one god, the sun god. This was considered a heresy by the Egyptians, but he was king, so he could get away with it. He had a whole new capital. He just decided a new society, a new king, and a new religion requires a whole new capital city. Edinburgh basically just announced a new city must be built out in the desert. Flinders Petrie excavated Edinburgh. Many other excavations have done Edinburgh, but they're usually of the high status buildings, the royal tombs, etc., the temples. Recent research has focused instead on the cemeteries, two huge cemeteries of the workers who built Akhenaten's new capital city. These are two cemeteries consisting of simple desert graves. You can see one on the right, which has two skeletons in the same grave cut, which is unusual in itself for Egyptian burials, even for poor people's burials. Ancient Egyptians would normally, their families would give them a individual, even if it's just a grave dug out of the desert sand, they would give them a proper burial of their own with some grave goods for the afterlife. These excavations in 2015 have sort of, they've discovered the Akhenaten was not just a rule breaker in his religion; he was a rule breaker of social conventions as well. The first cemetery to be excavated was quote unquote normal. 6,000 burials of workers who were building the city and Akhenaten's tomb. They were what the archaeologists expected to find. They were of poor people who had worked hard. Some of them had received workplace injuries. They'd had a restricted diet, but it was everything they would expect. They had people were in their individual graves. The population was quote unquote normal. There were mostly male and female adults with a high infant mortality. Lots of newly born children and all but people given their individual graves and given the proper burial rites. All as expected. The second cemetery, another huge cemetery to be excavated in 2015, another non-elite one, turned out to be very different. The graves are even simpler than you'd expect. Almost no grave goods, bodies just wrapped in rough matting, and as the case we see here, bodies, often multiple bodies put in one grave. They also didn't represent a quote unquote normal population either. Almost all of the skeletons are immature. Children, teenagers, and young adults. With no infants, no very young children, almost no children under about the age of 7, and no older adults. Almost all the skeletons aged between 7 and early 20s, the majority between 7 years old and 15, 16. This is the exact opposite to a usual pattern of a population you would find in a cemetery. In addition to it being an unnaturally young population, many of the skeletons had received traumatic injuries. I said in the other cemetery that they had, if you like, normal workplace injuries. These had many had much worse injuries. They also had degenerative conditions like osteoarthritis. And remember, these are mostly teenagers. And these degenerative conditions, spinal damage, etc., were very common. The interpretation is quite unpleasant and unique, a completely previously unknown situation for ancient Egypt. As I said, Akhenaten has turned out not just to be a religious heretic. He completely broke with Egyptian social norms. He appears to have assembled a child labour, effectively a slave, and I know I've been emphasising, and it's still right. Over the thousands of years of Egyptian history, even the most manual labour was not performed by slaves. This appears to be the exception that proves the rule, and they were child slaves, aged 7 to 15. And the fact that they were buried without any ceremony and with no grave clothes suggests they worked and died separated completely from their families and from normal Egyptian society. When Akhenaten died, his whole religious reforms completely collapsed, and his name was almost erased from history. His successors had his name carved out, removed from monuments and things. He was deliberately forgotten. Perhaps not just because of his religious reforms, but as we now know. Moving on, The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb. We saw the film poster from 1932, The Mummy, Boris Karloff lurching, and when Tutankhamun was excavated, there was said to be a curse over the tomb, and this is entered into popular culture as being a thing. If you disturb an ancient Egyptian's tomb, you will be cursed. Many of the excavators of Tutankhamun's tomb are said to have died early or died unnaturally, etc., etc. This is a myth. This is a European construction, an imposition upon the Egyptians that the Egyptians wouldn't have recognised. The first mummy's curse story, the first story, certainly in English, to describe a cursed tomb, it's called Lost in a Pyramid or The Mummy's Curse. It was written in 1869, and it was written by Louisa May Alcott, the author of Little Women. Who knew? In that story, the mummy of a sorceress gains her revenge through ancient seeds of a plant found in her tomb that poison those who grow them. The mummy doesn't come back to life, as in the Conan Doyle story or the Hammer story or Karloff story, but the tomb is cursed. The Egyptians did not curse their tombs. As I said, they were superstitious, they were highly religious, but they were also highly pragmatic. We know the Egyptians didn't curse their tombs. Thousands have been discovered and excavated. Thousands of tombs, I should say, have been excavated in ancient Egypt by now. The number of curses inscribed on the walls of Egyptian tombs is 3. The best evidence that we have that ancient Egyptians were not in fear of the curse of the mummy's tomb is that looting was widespread. Looting in ancient Egypt was widespread. Back to Flinders Petrie at the Pyramid of Awara, he excavated the tomb of Pharaoh Amenemhet, to discover how grave robbers could have found the tomb's opening and made their way through the labyrinth surrounding the two sarcophagi that they emptied. His only conclusion was that they must have bribed one of the designers and one of the builders to get the plans. It was such an elaborate labyrinth. And this tomb robbing was a major issue in ancient Egyptian society, and for the ruling class and their police. And they had a police force whose part of its main function was to protect the tombs. What we have here is a papyrus, again more of the cursive writing, the non-hieroglyphic writing, but in ancient Egyptian in the same language. And this is from Thebes, Egypt, 20th dynasty, about 1100 BC. A scandal erupted in Thebes in about the year 16 of the reign of Ramesses IX. Reports started to reach Pesa, the mayor of the eastern part of Thebes, that robberies had been taking place in the necropolis of the west bank of the Nile, particularly in the royal tombs. And this papyrus goes on and explains, on the basis of these reports, the mayor set up a commission to investigate the allegations. You see how non-mystic this is, and how very modern it sounds. The mayor has to set up a commission to investigate the allegations of tomb robberies. The papyrus reports the results of this investigation. It turns out actually all of the royal tombs were found to be intact. Only one tomb had actually been violated, a 17th dynasty king. Those robbers were caught, and the papyrus has survived that relates the trial of those robbers together with an account of the robbery itself. This goes on and on and on, and it involves political corruption, thieving that may have happened, thieving that one mayor was trying to blame on another mayor who was his political rival. It's a very modern thing, I think, to my ears, and a long way from what we think of as the sort of the mysterious and occult Egypt. There's another papyrus actually in the Museum of Scotland, which records raids, arrests, trials, exile, and executions of tomb robbers. This was a common thing. The police raided alleged robbers. They were put on trial. Sometimes they were found guilty. Sometimes they were found not guilty. Sometimes they were exiled. Sometimes they were executed. There's an inscribed stone that was found outside a tomb. This is not a curse. It's a plea. It pleads. It asks visitors, please don't take anything from our tomb, not even a pebble. But it's very much not a curse. It's a like, please don't do this. And to finish, the quite spectacular carving statue on the right is a pair. It's a husband and wife, and we know what his job is because there's an inscription that comes with this. He was the chief of the local police. This was excavated by Rind, who's another famous archaeologist from Scotland who worked in Egypt, who gave his name to the Rind Lectures. Look out for those. They're held every year, hosted every year by the Society of Antiquaries. But my point is, again, yes, this was a recognised position. This was a job. Being chief of police and trying to catch the tomb robbers was a thing in ancient Egypt. Cursing the tomb and having mummies chase you around the room was not a thing in ancient Egypt. And we can stop there. Thank you.